I have read the answers thus far, and I have noticed that quite a few of the facts are wrong, or the person giving the answer has provided a noticeably skewed response based on their own faith practices. Perhaps, not necessarily intentionally, or even knowingly, but it is in there and blatant. So, if you would prefer an academic answer, I can provide one. For full disclosure, I have a doctorate in the history of Western civilization, post-year 0 to present, so only AD I use, AD. Because, though not considered politically correct by some today, preferring instead the use of CE for Common Era, I find the notion somewhat perplexing because the dates and era references are still based on the birth of Christ, so I don't quite understand how that's better than an accepted, traditional Latin term most people don't know anymore, and a doctorate in Judeo-Christian theology, an academic degree not to be confused with a doctorate of divinity, which is not an academic degree in the US, but a degree granted by the person's particular church, often upon completion of advanced studies in seminary. Though, formally, if not addressing the person as Reverend, the accepted courtesy is to still address them as Doctor, in formal settings, regardless of the degree not being received from a secular academic institution. We're still civilized after all, and manners maketh man. So here we go. The Catholic Church became the Catholic Church as it's known today, after the formal split between the Catholic and Orthodox churches in 1054 AD. Before then the churches were one church, calling together and accepting the first 7 ecumenical councils. This singular church is the entity that composed the canon of the Christian Bible. This, one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, believed in apostolic succession, or the practice and belief that the bishops the Church, after first being chosen by the apostles, continued forward and could trace their lineage back to this very start, and, as such, is where the bishops derived their authority. There were also bishops of more authority known as patriarchs who had influence over a given geographical area. There was the Bishop of Rome, the Patriarch of Rome, and later the Primate of the West, what is known today as the Pope, which is actually derived from a colloquial term for father. The Pope is still the Bishop of Rome. There was the Bishop of Antioch, who was the Patriarch of Antioch. Then the Bishop of Jerusalem, who was the Patriarch of Jerusalem. So on. Later, after the founding of Constantinople, there became a Bishop of Constantinople, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople, later the Primate of the East, and the second highest patriarch after the Bishop of Rome, as Constantinople was the new Rome. These 5 patriarchs of the Church were essentially equal in authority, with the one exception of the Bishop of Rome, who was known as first among equals, and Primate of the Church. What this distinction comes from is basically the universal acknowledgement and nod of acceptance, within the then one, unified Church, theologically, to Christ's promise to Saint Peter that he is the rock upon which I will build my church, and, what you hold true on earth, I shall hold true in heaven. Since Saint Peter became the first bishop of Rome, and Rome was the capital and most important city in the Roman Empire, it was this position recognized with the honor. In the early Church, however, this distinction and honor had fairly defined and constrained privileges different from what we know today. The Bishop of Rome could simply call together councils, arbitrate disputes between other patriarchs and bishops, clarify theological issues of ambiguity, and speak first at meetings, if desired. Truly simply, first among equals. That's basically it. Essentially, in all other respects, the patriarchs were equal. Major theological decisions were made by a consensus or majority of the bishops at called and convened councils. Then, the Western Roman Empire fell, basically defined by the sacking of the Western Roman capital, Rome, in 410 AD and 455 AD, while the Eastern Roman Empire, later the Byzantine Empire, continued on with its capital being the Eastern Roman capital in Constantinople. With the fall of a common secular societal authority, the Bishop of Rome, the only common figure of authority in the West, essentially filled the void, and the Bishop of Rome's secular authority began to grow. However, at this point, and for roughly another 500 years, there was still a unified church. While the Bishop of Rome had his hands full essentially trying to keep some semblance of civilization going in the West, there also began to be problems in the East. A simple sum up of events is this. At some point, the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople began to get the idea that he didn't like sharing any sort of authority with another entity outside of his control, so began exerting influence and pressure on the bishop and patriarch of Constantinople. Fast forward a few hundred years, and this culminated when, after the church needed to fill the vacancy of the position, selected a new patriarch of Constantinople. The Eastern Emperor did not want or agree with the church's selection, so he supplanted the church's choice and appointed his own patriarch. After this, the Bishop of Rome sent legates, representatives of the Bishop of Rome representing the interests of the church's primate in the West. Again, this is the Bishop of Rome, to the Emperor and the newly installed Patriarch of Constantinople. After first insulting the legates by refusing to meet with them until a time of his choosing, essentially a political show of power and authority within his city and dominion, the Patriarch of Constantinople finally met with the legates. The meeting quickly devolved into an unparalleled and unmatched argument and display of chest-thumping on both sides, something unseen until this time and somewhat reminiscent of toddlers quarreling with each other, and became what would basically be considered today as an insult fest, and the two sides then promptly proceeded to excommunicate one another. The Patriarch excommunicated the legates and the Bishop of Rome, and ensuring one side did not one-up the other, the legates excommunicated the Patriarch. Afterward, several reconciliations were made and broken to reunify the church. The split was cemented and became permanent when a Muslim army invaded the Byzantine Empire, and the Crusader army sent from the west to assist, instead sacked Constantinople themselves. Since then, the church split into two separate churches, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. The Catholic Church in the West contained only one patriarch, the Bishop of Rome, which became the primary authority of the Church in the West. The Orthodox Church contained the rest of the patriarchs located in the East. I would hope that this would provide you with the answer you seek. The Catholic Church is most assuredly Christian. For the first 1,000 years, until the split of the Church into the Catholic and Orthodox churches, the one unified Church essentially was the Christian Church and the entity that shaped and guided Christianity as it is known today. With a few notable exceptions and outliners, such as the Coptic Christians in Egypt and what is now Ethiopia, and the Gnostic Christians very early on. Size-wise, however, they were no match for the much larger church that grew from the beginning. This church, from which the Catholic and Orthodox churches both directly descend, defined what is now mainstream Christian theology, such as the Holy Trinity, both the humanity and the divinity of Jesus, fully human and fully divine simultaneously, the establishment of the sacraments, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, the practice of bishops as central Christian authority figures, and so on. This is also the entity that compiled and established the Holy Bible. Thus, academically, it would be impossible to declare either the Catholic or Orthodox churches as not Christian. They literally ran the show, while unified, for the first 1,000 years, and then the Catholic Church continued to, for lack of a better term, dominate Christian thought and theology, especially in the West. Even to this day, of the just over 2 billion Christians on Earth, Catholics still comprise an overwhelming majority with 1.3 billion members. When you then account for the fact that the remaining number of Christians are then divided into an estimated 25 to 30,000 separate denominations, just in the simple scope of the size of this one Christian denomination, the Catholic Church can be better understood as the still prevalent, and the largest by far, force in Christianity. To attempt to state, academically, that only some of the denominations deriving from the Protestant Reformation are the only true Christians in existence today just doesn't follow logically. I can't see, from a historical standpoint either, how one cannot state that the largest denomination, and one of only two deriving from the once unified original institution, is indeed Christian. Especially because some relatively new movements resulted in the establishment of modern denominations that have developed with, and containing, what is a comparatively tiny fraction of the followers, that are collectively part of the overall religion that is Christianity. It does not intellectually follow that the minutiae can dictate the categorization of the majority. For the sake of making the point and driving it home, it would actually be far more likely, while admittedly it'd be a biased theological decision, that this same minority were recognized as not Christian, academically, if the Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, and Lutheran churches, essentially what could be loosely lumped together under the term high mass denominations, declared them as such, you'd basically have a supermajority of the overall Christian umbrella saying, they aren't with us. While I never believed that would happen, and then be recognized in academia, I'm just trying to illustrate the point that, just based on the numbers and doctrine, the denominations with a small minority of overall followers of the Christian faith declaring Catholics as not Christian, are themselves actually in a far more precarious position to be declared not Christian than the other way around. One must remember that groups are academically defined, usually and on the whole, by the majority of its members. Minorities, outliners, and smaller numerical groups are placed within subgroups of the larger category,